All right, so we're going to go ahead for this session, we're going to go ahead and review chapter 6. So before I jump into some of those questions, anybody, Chad, Don, did you have any questions on chapter 6 there? Otherwise, I'll just jump straight into the review. So I'm jumping in here. Hopefully, Chad, can you nod to tell me that you can see that screen? Is that okay? All right, so I'll start the quiz here. A client wishes to increase the output of their 5-year-old array. Which of the following options would be the best option, barring any unusual circumstances? So would you add additional panels to the system, add an active tracking system, replace all the panels with more efficient models, or add batteries? Well, the best solution here would be add panels, because the panels are only 5 years old. There would be no reason to replace them. You assume they have a warranty of about 25 years. A tracking system, that's going to increase your output, but it's also going to add a lot of mechanical failure points. Batteries don't really do anything there. So one of the ways, the best way of increasing the output would be just simply to add more panels. But hopefully, as you're starting to see in the next chapter, that's not always so easy to do, especially with string inverters, because you have to balance all of the strings. So if you had like 4 strings of 7 panels, you'd have to maybe add another string of 7. So you couldn't just add 1 panel. You'd have to add so that all of the strings are balanced. So that will become more evident as we move forward. Which of the following would be useful in determining if a specific site has enough sunlight to support a PV system? Well, a solar insolation map, a solar window declination chart, or a topological relief diagram. Well, in this case, we're asking for is a solar insolation map. But the better answer would be PV watts. A solar window, that's usually the period of time that the sun is shining at a site. So you would refer to the solar window as like 10 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. That'd be your solar window. Declination chart, that's that chart that's in the book that talks about how far off magnetic north you are or magnetic south. And then topological relief diagram, that's just talking about elevations. If you're into orienteering or whatever, you'll have topological maps. So when adjusting the orientation of a solar panel from east to west, this adjustment affects, and the term there that we use is its azimuth. The above off the horizon, I think that's the next question, is the altitude. Declination is how far off of magnetic south or magnetic north you are. And of course, resistance, that's a electrical characteristic. So when adjusting it up and down, you're talking about its altitude. Normally, unless you're talking about a ground-mounted system, you don't have a lot of say about its altitude. And often you don't have a lot of say about its azimuth, because the house is going to face the way it faces. The roof pitch is as it is. Unless you've got a flat roof where you can adjust the pitch based on your racking system, you don't want to have what's referred to as a flush to roof system. So for instance, if this here is the pitch of the roof, you don't want your panels coming at a pitch that's different than the pitch of the roof. You want to do a flush to roof pitch for a number of reasons. One is aesthetic. If you do this, it's going to look terrible, but it also then puts stress and can pull off of there. So most of your pitched roofs are going to have a flush to roof system. And if the pitch of the roof is 15 degrees, well, then that's going to be the pitch of your system. And if the orientation is not true south, well, then your orientation is not going to be true south. You'll just have to work around that. Which type of mounting system will increase the amount of time a panel directly faces the sun? This will be a tracking system. And there's usually a single axis or a dual axis tracking system. The single axis would either follow azimuth or altitude, so it will adjust either daily or seasonally. And a dual axis, which is usually a pole mounted system, will do both. It will adjust altitude and azimuth so that it's facing the sun all the time. And this will produce quite a bit more power. The problem is it's a mechanical device, and any mechanical device is going to have maintenance issues and it's going to have points of failure issues. Oftentimes you'll find these tracking systems and they're locked in the position where they were when they failed. So most people, unless you're on a utility scale system, you're going to find that you're just dealing with fixed angles because there's no maintenance. If you need more power, just add some more panels, because the panels are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So rather than getting 20% more power from a tracking system, you're going to find just add 20% more panels. It's a lot easier, unless there's a space issue. Most PV arrays utilize a passive air cooling system. And this is why you've got to offset your panels about 6 inches off the roof. It's usually 4 to 9 inches in that range. But you need to be able to let the air flow under them and around them. And that is what keeps everything cool. And I've seen some systems, some situations where the homeowner has taken the solar array and they're having a problem with squirrels or something like that, getting in there and chewing the wires. So they do make what they refer to as squirrel guards that go around the perimeter of the solar array, and they're like a mesh screen that keeps these squirrels from getting in there and making nests or chewing on the wire. But I've seen where they've taken like flashing and just made a solid barrier to keep the squirrels out. And that's a really bad idea, because now what you've done is you've essentially made a solar oven up on top of your roof, and you haven't allowed for that passive air cooling. So under the array, it's going to get hotter and hotter and hotter, and it can actually cook your shingles, and it will affect the electronic devices that are in there, and the panels won't generate as much power. So passive air cooling is typically, although now we're starting to see what they call photovoltaics, floating solar arrays. They sit on the water, and that helps to cool. So you're seeing solar arrays installed in lakes, usually where there's hydro power systems. And that added cooling nature of the water actually produces more power, because the colder it is, the better the system behaves. If no bias is introduced into the altitude of a fixed solar panel, the angle will likely be based on, and the answer here is latitude. And it's not that your angle is going to be exactly your latitude. You would think that if you're at 40 degrees north latitude, that you would want the solar array at 40 degrees, because then at the equinoxes, at the spring and the autumnal equinox, the panel's going to be facing directly towards the sun. And then in the wintertime, it's going to be lower. In the summertime, it's going to be higher. But on average, your angle and your latitude are going to be the same. And that makes logical sense, except that in most parts of the world, we have what's referred to as a summer bias, because the days are longer in the summertime and there's more sunshine in the summertime. So you get more sunlight in the summer half of the year than you do in the winter half. So you're better off tilting your angle of the panel a little more flat to take advantage of the longer sunlight. And that would be referred to as a summer bias. And that's typical pretty much everywhere in the world. So here we're referring to a winter bias is latitude plus 15 degrees. So if I had my example here where this is latitude, plus 15 degrees is going to turn it up. So then that would be focusing on the winter months. Latitude minus 15 degrees is summer bias. That's focusing on the summer months. So typically what you're going to find in this region of the world, in Ohio, I-70 runs right along the 40-degree parallel, pretty close. So 25 degrees is our summer bias, and that's about the angle you're going to want to set your panels, right at about 25 degrees. What you'll find is anywhere between 20 and 35, that's going to work. Not a whole lot of difference there. Remember, as I'm doing this, as I'm reviewing, if any of you guys have any questions, just pop right in. Don't worry about interrupting me. I'm used to it. When evaluating a roof for possible PV array, which is not a consideration, age of the shingles, well, yeah, that's a consideration. You don't want to put a solar array on an old roof because you might have to then remove it in order to fix the shingles. Condition of the rafter, of course it is. It's an issue. It's got to be able to support the weight. The pitch of the roof, well, that's an issue, obviously, but you don't have a lot of control over it. And its demarcation point. Well, the answer is demarcation point, probably because you don't even know what that is, but a demarcation point is typically where one person's responsibility ends and the other begins. So in a solar array system, that's usually the electrical meter. That's where the utility company's requirements begin and the homeowner's ends, or vice versa, depending on which way you're coming. A two-dimensional diagram representing the tracking of the sun over a whole year is called, logically enough, a sun chart. And we end up using that in shading analysis in a solar pathfinder. This is what a sun chart looks like. And you'll use that in a solar pathfinder to find out when shade is going to be on a particular spot any time of the year. When placing an array on the roof, which of the following should be considered? The live weight, the dead weight, condition of the rafters, or all of the above? Well, the answer here is going to be all of the above. The live weight is the weight of everything, like the wind flowing over the array, people walking on the roof, seismic activity. The dead weight's just really the shipping weight of the system. So the physical weight if you picked it up. When placing several rows of ground-mounted panels in order to avoid inter-row shading, what do? Well, the panels should be used in a landscape orientation. Well, that's not the case. They should be at least 9 feet apart. Adjust the azimuth to not less than 15 degrees off true south, or none of the above. In this case, it's going to be none of the above. And the reason for that is I'm going to share the little drawing thing here. Is what we're talking about here with inter-row shading is, let's assume this is the front row of panels and this is the back row of panels and the racking system and everything is here. The sun coming in is going to cast a shadow. And you want to make sure that you've set the panels far enough apart so that the shadow does not fall on the array behind it. So how do we do that? Well, it depends on your latitude, but usually what we're going to say is the distance in this region, in this area, whatever this is, the distance here is going to be X. Then we want to set our array back 3 times that distance. So this would be 3x. So if this is going to be, let's say, 4 feet up, then we need to go 12 feet back. It's just a rough rule of thumb for this latitude. You can get more exacting, but it's not going to be far off of that. The further you go towards the North Pole, the longer the shadows are going to be, so the further back you need to go. So if you're installing a system, let's say up in Upper Michigan, if it's 4 feet up, you might want to go 16 feet back. And if you're going closer to the equator, let's say South Florida, maybe you only need to go, 8 or 10 feet back, because the sun will be more directly overhead. So it's generally a 1-to-3 ratio in this part of the region. Yeah, John, I've got you on mute, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So is there any merit to making each row on a ground mount system like 2 layers? Instead of doing a bunch of single layers, you do a couple double layers. But what's the advantage? Is it just more wind and more hassle, or you know what I'm asking?
Yeah. Normally, most of your systems, depending on the racking system, are going to be, for instance, you might have three rows, 6 columns, for instance, like 18 panels on a single rack. Um, that will just increase the height. So if you're needing enough to go a second row behind it, you'll have to go further back. But most racking systems are going to be like that. Let me go back to my whiteboard just to make sure. So typically what you're saying is, let's say this is my front row. Would it make sense to go something like this, right? And then come back here with my array, my second row? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, right. I mean, is there any plus or minus to either one of those strategies?
Yeah, for sure. Because obviously there's a lot of cost in the supports. So if you were going with just a single row, you're going to be putting in a lot of supports just to hold one panel, one row of panels. So the efficiency is typically going to be based on your railing system and your racking system. But most of them that I've seen end up being like 3 rows, and then you can have as many columns as you want.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah,
You
so
answered the question. I got it. Yeah.
okay.
About 3.
Yeah, about 3. And part of that, the reason is the rails usually come in 11-foot lengths. So if these rails just standardly are 11 foot, 3 panels will fit on it without you having to special order a different rail.
And that's a landscape 3.
Yeah, a landscape 3, which
Okay.
again, for many of your systems, that's fairly typical for a ground mounted system.
Okay. All right.
Okay. All right, let me go back to the questions here. All right, so in this case, it's going to be none of the above because it's saying, and here you can use this formula if you want. I wouldn't recommend it because it's a pain, unless you're really into calculus, but just a 1-to-3 is good enough. I was at an install one time where the guy insisted on using that. And I was saying, well, it's about 6 feet tall. We go back about 18 feet. And he's like, oh, let me figure it out. He spent like 40 minutes. Came back, it was like 17 feet, 9.5 inches. It's like, yeah, about 18 feet. All right, when placing the balance of systems, ensure that they're facing as close to solar south as possible. All cabinets and cases are rated for interior conditions. They don't contain any overcurrent. Well, we don't want them facing south because we want them out of the sun. If they're outside, they shouldn't be rated for interior. And of course, many of them do contain overcurrent protection. What we mean by that are fuses and breakers. So the answer here is going to be none of the above. Okay, peak sun hours is a measurement of the locations. And in this case, we're talking about insolation. And just to make sure everybody's clear, I'll explain the difference between insolation and peak sun and radiance. So let's say we've got a square meter here. And remember that under standard test conditions, we assume irradiance equals 1,000 watts per square meter. Well, over the course of the day, the sun's going to be in the east. It's going to come in at a low angle. It's not going to be giving you 1,000 watts per square meter. There are going to be clouds. There are going to be other things that occur. So what they do is they measure on that square meter, and over the course of the day, let's assume they find that 5,468 watt hours, because that's watts over time, hit this particular square meter on an average day. So that all they're doing is saying, okay, we've measured how many watts hit this over time, and we've got 5,468 watt hours. So then we say, well, an hour of sunlight or an hour of insolation is the number of watt hours hitting that square meter divided by STC, or 1,000 watts, and we end up in this case 5.468 hours because the watts cancel. And in this, so what we would refer to here is that this place, this location, got 5.468 hours of insolation. So it's just a conversion from irradiance, which is measured in watts or watt hours, and it's insolation, which is measured in hours. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. All right. So which of the following is an example of the dead weight of a system? Well, the dead weight is really just the shipping weight of the racks and the panels. That's the dead weight of a system. And it's usually only going to be 2 to 3 pounds per square foot, not very much. The live weight is usually a lot more. And of the live weight measurements, it's the wind going over the solar array that's the biggest issue. Because the solar array can act a bit like a wing on an airplane, and it can pull up and it can push down. And in some cases, it can push down as much as 50 pounds per square inch, or square foot, sorry. So which is preferred, landscape or portrait orientation? Well, essentially, it's determined by the racking. You know, there is no really preferred mechanism. It's just how was the racking designed? Was it designed to deal with landscape orientation or portrait orientation? Determining restrictions on the height of the building adjacent to the property where an array is mounted might be an example of, and here I'm kind of looking for future proofing. What I'm saying is, let's say that you're building a solar array and it's ground mounted system, but you don't realize that next door they're going to be putting in a 10-story building, and that 10-story building is going to block the sunlight. So you need to double check and see, you know, what are the future plans of adjacent property before you commit to paying a large amount of money to put in a solar array. All right, using the below declination map, estimate the adjustment required for Denver, Colorado. So I found that I had to let people know where Denver, Colorado was. So I put a big old red X right here in the middle of Colorado. So if we know that we need a declination, notice that it falls between 10 and 12. So we know that we're going to have to adjust it by about 11 degrees off of south or off of north. At this point, we're not 100% sure. Since almost all declination charts are for aviation, they're based on north. So this is saying you'd have to make an 11-degree adjustment off to the east if you're heading north. But since we're worried about the south, we would say that you're going to make an 11-degree adjustment to the west for south. So the way I remember that is you'll notice that the zero line here pretty much runs along the Mississippi River. Not quite, more like 2 degrees, but it's pretty close. So I say we adjust to the west for everything west of the Mississippi, and we adjust to the east for everything east of the Mississippi. That becomes pretty easy to remember. So in this case, we're going to orient the array 11 degrees east of magnetic north. That's probably not a good way of saying that. I should say we're making the adjustment because we don't want to orient the array to the north, but it's 11 degrees east of north or west to east for south. I should probably go in there and correct that. An array facing solar west will likely produce about what percent energy than if it's facing south. And it turns out it's only going to be about 20 degrees less. So if we're facing due east, it's only going to be about 20% loss. This diagram shows the sweet spot that you're looking for is within this slice that's 45 degrees of south. So either 22.5 to the east or 22.5 to the west. That's the best orientation. You're only going to lose about 5%. But if you have an east-west oriented roof, not the end of the story. You can use it. It's just that you got to put in 20% more solar panels than you would if that thing were facing south. Using the sun chart below, determine the optimal angle for an array to capture the most energy on March 30th at 10 a.m. solar time. So 10 a.m. solar, remember it's not 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, it's 10 a.m. solar time. And solar noon is when the sun is at its zenith, highest. And we said March 30th, so that's going to be right about April 1st. We're right here. And if we go off, that's 45 degrees azimuth, altitude, and 135 degrees or so azimuth. So that would be your tracking system. And so you would just sort of answer that, just to practice on how to read a sun chart. That's all that question is trying to do. One limitation of conducting a remote site assessment includes that LiDAR imagery is inherently unreliable. The assessment tools are too expensive to be practical. On-site visits save time and money, and that imagings often rely on outdated information. Well, really, we're looking for the fact that imaging systems often have old data. They often rely on Google Maps or Google Earth, sorry, and Google Earth, may be several years old. So you may find that trees that were there are no longer there, or that they've grown, or that there have been buildings built or whatever. So the remote imaging systems are good as a first step, but you really have to go out and look at the site. There's no substitute for that. The total theoretical amount of solar energy available at a given site is known as that site's, I think it's total solar resource, if memory serves, right? That is the amount of power that's available at that site if everything is perfect. Basically, the panel is oriented at exactly the right altitude and azimuth, and there's no shading issues. And the reason this is going to be important, we'll get into this in some future questions, is sometimes you'll be dealing with grants or governmental restrictions that say that the total solar resource fraction cannot be less than a certain percentage of the total available resource. So where they're getting at is, let's say that they have looked at this location, it's Indianapolis, Indiana, and based on sunlight at that location, you should be able to get this amount of power if everything's perfect. So let's assume that's 100%. But you're going to lose some based on orientation and tilt, like if the angle is not exactly right or the azimuth is not exactly right. And if there's some shading, you may lose some there. So total amount minus tilt factor minus shading factor is going to give you your total solar resource fraction. And that can't be less than, let's say, 80%. Otherwise, they don't want to give you the grant because you're not using it wisely. So that becomes an issue often in those cases. Total amount of solar energy collected as compared to the theoretical amount, well, that's the fraction. So this is going to be your theoretical amount, the total resource, minus tilt, minus shading is going to give you your total resource fraction. And hopefully that's going to be 100, but almost never is. It's always going to be some loss. A solar array is sited at a location that has an optimal resource of 4.68 hours. Given the orientation of the array, it receives only 3.92 hours, and it has a shading factor, 5% shading. So right there, you could figure out, okay, well, what's 3.92 divided by 4.68? That's going to be, I'm just going to wing this in my head, but somewhere in the, what, 80%, 85%, somewhere like that. And then you've got 5% loss because of shading. So my guess, it's going to be either 79.57 or 83.76. It's going to be one of those two. If I took the time to do the math, I'm going to guess this. I might guess wrong. And then the answer is, I guess, correctly. So what we've done is we found that based on orientation and tilt, we're at an 83.76%. And then we have to subtract another 5% because of shading. So we multiply those and we end up at 79.57. Does that make sense to everybody? Pretty straightforward. A cabinet rated for outdoor wet conditions. Well, this is just sort of remembering NEMA 3 is an outdoor wet. And there's a diagram in your book, a chart here, tells you the different conditions. By code, what is the maximum amount of power that can be generated by an inverter, which is load side connected to a 100 amp rating service connected to a 100 amp service from the utility? So let me go back into the whiteboard here to see what we're talking about. So I'm going to go up here and clear this. So what we're saying is here's your service panel. And you're coming in from the utility. So this is going to be your utility lines here, transformer, all of that. All right. And we're coming into a main breaker and it's telling us we have 100 amps. So we've got a 100 amp breaker and we look at the label and it says that the bus bar rating for this unit is 100 amps. Now we want to come in with a solar array and we always come in and make our connection as far away from the main as possible. So you would want to be either on the bottom right-hand corner of the panel or the bottom left-hand corner, as far away, and that's usually where the empty spots are going to be anyway. So that's where you want to come in. And so what the question is asking is if you have a 100 amp service and the panel is rated for 100 amps, how much can you bring in? Well, the National Electrical Code, you could look at this and say, okay, we've met our rating, so I can't put solar in here. But the NEC says, you know what, you almost never use all the amps. So we're going to let you go to 120% of whatever the rating is. So that's telling me I can come in with a 20 amp breaker from my inverter. So this is my inverter. And then that goes to my solar array. All right, so I can come in with 20 amps. So what size solar array will I be using, or what size inverter? What size system? AC. Well, you might just say, all right, we know that this is grid tied, and if it's single phase electric, it's going to be operating at 240 volts AC. And because watts equals amps times volts, I'm going to say 240 volts times 20 amps, and we're going to be 4,800 watts. So I could put in a 4,800 watt inverter. Problem is, the National Electrical Code also says that for wire sizes, I need to multiply times 1.25 for my safety margin. So I have to derate this by my safety factor. So in this case, I divide by 1.25, which is the safety. And if I do the numbers, I don't have a calculator here, but I think it's somewhere around, what is it, 3840 or something like that. It'll be in your answer. Jump here. Yeah, 3840. So that's going to be the correct answer. And as I said, it's because you can go to 120% of your bus bar rating, and it's going to be coming in at 240 times 20, 4,800. We have to derate by 1.25, so we divide and we end up at 38.4. So this is one of the reasons why inverter sizes, if you go out there and start pricing your inverters, you're going to find one of the standard sizes is 3.8 kW. And another standard size for an inverter is 7.6 kW. Well, those seem to be odd numbers unless you understand this 120% rule, because a 3.8 kW inverter is sized just for the situation where you have a 100 amp panel with 100 amp service. A 7.6 is for a 200 amp service with a 200 amp panel. So that's why they are that way. Okay, so that takes us to the end of the Chapter 6 review. Anybody have any questions from what I've just gone over? Speak now or forever hold your peace. I know Don's in class. Chad, you got any questions there? I can see you. John's hiding. So, all right. Well, let's call it a day, and we'll get back together on Friday, and we'll begin Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is a bear, so be ready to be a little bit confused. All right. Take care. See you guys later. Bye-bye.